and how Uber has taken over entire set of companies in the West. Or maybe these companies have underestimated the potential of it ruling out in India. We already had certain e-commerce successes like Flipkart, like Snapdeal, and so on. So a trend like this was very easy to discover and predict. And as I said, if the direction is known, then within 2 months you would have been able to put an app across. The point is, did you point it out? Did the business do it? And the answer most likely is no. So this is one example. I'll give you another example. So, for example, you are in a company which is doing some of the most complex projects in some of the most remote regions of the world. For example, the projects are there in Africa, projects are there in some of the various remote parts of India, and so on, where there are local languages and so on. And there you have got an installation of an infrastructure project, which has got its own nuances when it comes to timely completing of projects. There are companies which are able to do it much successfully, and there are companies which are not able to do it and are bleeding in a big way. So if you were to typically look at an infrastructure company, and the way it is building up the infrastructures and the way in which it charges the government or some of the private players. For example, if you're building a township for a large company like Infosys, Infosys doesn't have an inside infrastructure producing capability, so it will go to an outside vendor like L&T, for example, right? So if that is the large project which has got to be installed, A, do you understand the nuances of the project? Do you understand enough about the engineering involved in the project? C, do you really understand the basics of project management? Like, for example, when the project was taken up, at the time when it was taken up, you had got certain estimations. Can any project be taken up without estimations of profitability? No, right? So when you passed the business case for a project, you had a cash flow estimation, you had an IRR estimation, you had an NPV estimation. When you did all of that, you came up with a number, and there were certain assumptions, and you said that, okay, this project is viable, it is giving me an IRR of about, let's say, 15%, and I should go for this. And that was your go, no go, right? So had it given you 5%, you'd have not gone for it. Had it given you anything more than 14%, let's say, which is the cost of capital or an internal rate of return requirement, 15% you would go for it, right? Now let's say you have got a project which is giving you 18% and you put a buffer of 3%. Still you are there with a 15% expectation, because your expectation, your core expectation was 14%, including your cost of capital, and you are, despite the uncertainties, you are able to build up the buffer of 3%, and still you are making 1%. That was a go, no go. But if the realities of the actual life turn out to be completely different, let's say the actual profitability is less than 4%. What happens? If this was known to you, you would have not gone for this project. And there are areas like this which are very, very complex business issues. You have to come up as an internal auditor and say that, sorry, this project shouldn't have been accepted. And how? Basically, you will say that, look, there was a 3%, a very safeguarded 3% buffer which was kept in. Still you expected 15%. So the minimum that you would have expected for go, no go was 15%. So from 18%, you can come down to 16%. You can come down to 15.5%. But you cannot come less than 14% or 15% at all. And that was a very important point. And then you have to go back and look at what assumptions were built into the entire business case. And what have gone wrong? Obviously, some of those assumptions have gone wrong. So what have gone wrong from there? And if you are able to understand this, You are able to go back and tell the management that, look, here are the areas where you did wrong. These are the places that you should have made certain realistic assumptions. And therefore, based on that, this is the decision that you should have taken. Are you able to say this? Are you able to go back and say what exactly went wrong? There were certain regulatory approvals which didn't come in time. There were certain suppliers which didn't deliver you in time. And there are certain operational issues, like for example, rework or redesign, all of that, which came in and which obstructed you to go towards your objective of making at least 15% returns on the project. If you are able to understand all of this, you will become more and more close to the business. And that is where it is very, very important, very, very extremely important for internal auditor to go back and understand real business issues, point them out, and draw the entire attention of the management and the audit committee towards the future improvements. And these are the business improvements, the real business improvements. So, having said this, very clearly, all of us now understand that yes, there is a need for business context. Yes, there is obviously a need for a risk-based thinking, but one part of this is risk-based thinking, the other part of this is look at the business issues. And the more you are able to look at the business issues, the better you will be able to address the needs of the organization to improve and move towards the future. So, having said this point, I would like to move towards my presentation, which I'll just put up. And again, an important point to note, a very important point to note, is that we really have actually, as internal auditors in the past, have actually missed a few important items. You know, for example, if you take some of the real examples of the live failures, like let's say, for example, the Lehman Brothers failures. If you would really look at the business issues there, you would have been easily be able to point those out and say that, look, here are the real issues. Here are the real issues. And for example, you know, in the case of Lehman Brothers, the real issue was the leveraging. So the entire financing industry in the US, for example, operated at a certain capital adequacy. Most of the investment bankers did not operate with the adequate leverage. So for example, in the US or in the other parts of the world, there is a real requirement of maintaining a certain capital adequacy ratio of, let's say, something about 9 to 10%. Most of the investment bankers came and said, sorry, we are not bankers, we are investment bankers. And as a result of which we don't need to follow the traditional banking model. And therefore we don't need capital adequacy. And which, therefore, with the capital of about $3 to $4, they were able to leverage up to $100. So with your own capital of 3% or 4%, you were able to pick up leveraged assets of $100, which is 3 or 4%. Most of the investment bankers operated like that, which was a highly risk model, a big risk model, you know, which completely failed, as a result of which we saw most of the failures. Had these investment bankers operated with a proper capital adequacy, and which is what, you know, some of the committees which came later have actually made now mandatory for investment banking regulations to put capital adequacy as a requirement. So this is one of the other example, and as I said, moving towards my presentation. And here is where I have actually pointed out in this slide, if you look at, There is this traditional internal audit function. There is a risk-based internal audit function, which is the second bucket here. And there is internal audit with a business context. So let me remind you, I am not saying that we need to replace the risk-based internal audit as a model. I'm only saying that while we have this risk-based thinking, alongside that risk-based thinking, we need to have a very important eye on the business context. As I said, some of the examples that I gave, I think it's very, very important to be relevant in that business, to know what's happening, what are the trends, etc., and to point out those issues. I'm only saying that you have to sharpen your risk-based thinking to add some of the really focusing and sharp business issues, which are the issues of the future. And therefore, there is a slight difference from even a risk-based thinking. So when we look at traditional, the risk-based thinking, and the business context thinking, there are really 4 areas where the difference lies in terms of 4 parameters. And those parameters are A, the tools. So in your traditional model, you followed certain tools. In your risk-based model, you followed certain tools. And in your business context thinking, you still follow certain tools. And these tools are different. Similarly, outcomes. The outcomes in these 3 thinkings are very different. For example, the outcome in the traditional internal audit thinking would typically be something like unauthorized expenditure. You have exceeded your limit, right? You made an expense, you have exceeded that limit, and you will say, look, there is an exceeding of expenditure, there is an unauthorized expenditure, and so on. Because there are rules, you know the numbers, you know the limits, based on which there is an unauthorized expense. You will say there is inadequate supporting. There is inadequate evidence of this. Or there is not enough documentation to support this. And that could be an outcome, which is relevant. Which is relevant to run business effectively. I'm not saying it's not relevant. But if you move to a risk-based thinking, you would move towards a system, process, and a control thinking, and you would say the outcomes would be non-compliance with the business rules, that is the SOPs and the policies. Non-compliance with certain important rules which have been formulated. Not just limits, not just amounts, but also the way in which business is carried out. And when you move to a business context thinking, you would go about and point out issues like revenue enhancements, like business disruptions. I just mentioned about it. The example of Uber and the example of TapCab and Meru, if you were an internal audit of those companies. You would talk about certain decisions that have been gone wrong, like the project go-no-go decision. You shouldn't have taken the project, you have taken the project. You could have spoken about it had you known the business issues. So the outcomes are really different, as I'm saying, in all the 3 things. The tools are different. The approach is different. And the business relevance is different. So my then immediate question to you people is, which of these approaches is using the most sophisticated tools? Traditional thinking, risk-based thinking, or a thinking which is business contextual thinking? Which is using the most sophisticated tools? Come on, it's a very easy answer. It is business context, obviously. And what are the tools for business context? So you have got business intelligence, you have got artificial intelligence, and mind you, internal auditors are actually using some of these tools. I'll tell you how. Most of your transactions today, in most of the businesses today, happens in an ERP platform. Whether it is purchasing, whether it is inventory, whether it is financial decisions, all of this happens on an ERP platform. If that is the case, it is very easily possible for an internal auditor, before starting actually the audit and the conversations with your auditee, to just go back and take that data from the dump and do your own analytics. So in a way, when you go to the management, you are very prepared because you have got everything. So your delegation of authority is lying in your ERP. You've got limits, the purchase orders and other limits, which is lying in your ERP. You've got your transactions, which is lying in your ERP system. You take all of that, you run certain scripts. A manufacturing company is a manufacturing company at the end of the day. Whether it is manufacturing chemicals, or whether it is manufacturing an automotive component, or it is manufacturing some of the air parts, spare parts of certain aircrafts. It is a manufacturing company. The rules are rules in a manufacturing industry. And if that is the case, you could have easily got that data, did some data analytics, understood about that business, and then went to the auditee. That improves a lot of time, a lot of investment, and a lot of hidden cost which is involved. Because you are wasting your time, on the other hand, you are wasting management's time. It's a very big element. And which is why most of the companies today, when they appoint an internal auditor, the first thing that they look at is, do you have an experience in our industry? Why do they look for that? 10 years back, they were not looking for it. Why are they looking for it today? They're looking for it because they don't want to waste their time explaining you the business. They just want to start off and just move up straight away. And therefore, the tools like business intelligence, the artificial intelligence, the analytics tools, the forensic tools, the internal audit workflow and the documentation tool, something like iPads and virtual PCs. These are very, very important. So for example, your internal audit workflow tool, which is the end-to-end of your internal auditing, including your report, your classification into high, medium risk, all of this will sit into your auditee's iPads. And this is very simple. It's not something very, very big sophisticated thing which I'm talking about. Your iPad today, the auditee would have an iPad, and you will have the entire dashboard of internal audit sitting on the iPad of the auditee. And this is real. So this is what is, when you talk about business context, the tools change, the outcomes change, the approach changes, and the business relevance changes. So I'll give you again one example which is covered later in my presentation. And I'll give you one very, very simple example of how the outcomes change. There was an airline company where an internal auditor was doing a business context-based internal audit. In that company, he was able to do certain market intelligence. And the perspective of this is like this, which I'm just saying. There was about 3,500 crores of Indian rupees worth of revenue which this company was making. 3,500 crores worth of revenue. And about 7% of this came from group discount booking. What is group discounts? The discounts which are provided if the number of passengers travel more than 6 or more than 7. You have to just call up this airline company on a call center and say that, look, we are 5-7 people traveling and we want a group discount. And there is a straight policy of any airline company today to give you a straight 12 to 15% discount if you are in a group of more than 6-7 people. And I'm sure, when we travel in institute, there are similar schemes that we have with the airline companies. Because there may be so many people on the same flight, where you can get discounts. Now, if you really look at this company from a business context perspective, from a real business business context perspective, this company was actually making only 7%. The internal auditor of this company made certain market intelligence based benchmarking. And that benchmarking was, if I am making 7%, what are the competitors making? And then it found out that some of the local benchmarks, some of the best run companies in India, in the airline industry, and I'm sure you know the names, some of the best run companies are making 15% out of group booking as one of the segments of the business revenue. Right? We have segments of business revenue, segmental reporting, right? So this data may be easily available. How much are you making from group discounts? How much are you making from travel agents? How much are you making from direct retail? How much are you making from some of the e-commerce player like Make My Trip, etc.? So all of this is segmental revenue, business revenue, which is available in your financial statements, which is available in your internal MIS, and all the records and documentation internally. That this is what I'm making. This is what his competitors making. So some of the advanced airlines would be making, let's say, 14%. Then that internal auditor went and did international